Good morning. We'll go ahead and get started. Today the webinar is going to be covering Intacct reports. The agenda is a smaller agenda than we're used to. We're going to take a quick look at financial reports, and then we're going to dive into two specific reports: the Dimension Balance Report through General Ledger and Purchasing Transaction Detail Reports, which is a custom report that I built that can help us find transactional information for purchasing. So in discussing these reports, some key terms to think of as we talk about the reports or use different reporting periods. Fiscal year specifically means the tribe's fiscal year, October 1 to September 30th. So when Intacct was designed for us, it was based upon that as the fiscal year. Some programs have funds that operate outside of that. So fiscal year type of reports or periods aren't going to work the same for those programs. The term encumbrance or commitment we see in our reports, either on general ledger reports or financial reports, and that basically means requisitions have been placed for property, goods, contracts, and services during a given period that place a hold on the selected budget to prevent future spending. These are obligations for which an expenditure has not been recorded. Accrual, it's the reporting book we use to record revenue and expense activity. This will be important when we get into the Dimension Balance Report, because we can choose the type of book we want to use to report information for. When we look at a normal financial report, when we see the columns for like month to date, fiscal year to date, life to date, those are reporting activity from our accrual book, the actual expenses and revenue that we've collected. We have another reporting book called encumbrance, and that's what records the property, contract, services, and/or goods or other similar transactions for encumbering our budget. So when we look at our financial reports, the encumbrance column is reporting activity that's been booked to the encumbrance book. So that might make more sense when we get into the Dimension Balance Report. So we'll start with financial reports, and we'll dive into Intacct now. At this point, most users would be familiar with going up to the application menu, going to reports, and then to the report center to find our financial reports. The screen is designed for several things to help make this easier for us. Across the top, we have some extra reports or tabs for favorites, all reports, memorized, scheduled, and then custom reports. Typically, as a user, we're going to be on favorites or all reports. I keep my option on all reports, and then here we can choose a different subcategory for reports based on whatever we're looking for, like financial reports for the fiscal year to date, life to date type of reports. That I also just keep on all applications, so all reports, all applications, which means it's easier for me to find a report. Sometimes a user will call, they can't find a certain report. And if they were stuck in their favorites but didn't favorite that report, that's not going to be on the list. Or if we change this category to something else, like if I change it to purchasing, I won't be able to find fiscal year reports by leaving this on the purchasing category. So for me, I find it easier just to leave all reports, all applications selected. What we can do as users, depending on our access, this list we see is all the reports we have access to. And so depending on your access level, this can be a pretty long list of reports. Like for me, is probably close to about 100 different types of reports. If we know the title or one of the words in the title of the report, we can use this search bar. For example, if we were looking for our reports that just show one funding source, if I type the word one and start typing funding source, through the search, now the reports list will minimize to just those things that have the word one fund. So we can see one funding source here. There's the fiscal year ones, historical for our out of service funding sources, and then life to date monthly report reports that have one funding source view as an option. But it's a pretty valuable search tool to use to just navigate through your reports faster. If we wanted just the life to date reports, I type life to date, and that's going to do that, and it's going to zero in on just those for us. And then, of course, any of these reports can be run primarily by clicking on the title of the report, which takes us to the prompt screen, which as users, we're going to say, when do we want the report created as of? And it says 8/12, so we want the information all the way leading to today's date. So that's the default date. If we wanted to change the period, we could change the date because maybe we only want fiscal year 20 information. We have to select our program. We have to select at least one checkbook, and we can leave funding source blank if you want all the funding sources that are available to you through the program and checkbook selection, or you can specify a funding source if you want it just to be for a specific one. And the report I selected was the encumbrance by vendor, so you can also pick a vendor on that one if you're only researching a specific vendor. When we're running the reports, particularly life-to-date reports, and this works for fiscal as well, but depending on how many years your funds have been used, the life-to-date report might not run on a timely basis by just running it by clicking the title and putting in the filters, the prompts that were given to you. And sometimes it times out for a person, or it takes a while. The best thing you can do for life-to-date reports is, rather than clicking the title, is at the end there's a more actions place. We click more actions, we have something called process and store that's available to us. So if I click that, functionally we get the same thing as we do for the other prompts. We can schedule a report to run. So maybe we didn't want the report today, but at the end of this week or on Monday, someday in the future, we wanted this report to be available. So we can pick the day we want the report run on. What's the checkbook we're using? So for map 21, we'll have our checkbook entered in there. Our program. If you have access to multiple programs, you can even use the option for all programs. If there's a specific funding source that you want the report to be available for, this is your chance to put that in here. If we're doing a thing like all programs and a checkbook, so we're probably looking for multiple funding sources, we can leave that blank. When do we want this information to be ready for? And so it's through August 12th. So this report would run for a life to date then, as long as all these funding sources have been used through August 12th. If we needed it for a different period, say through July, we can just change the day and say we want this information all the way through July 31st. And then we have to choose how we want this report to be delivered to us, because it's going to run offline and not on our screen and not tie up Intacct for us. And so we're going to store in Intacct, and then we can choose the types. HTML is the default type that shows up when you run a report on screen. You can have it in a printable format, basically PDF. CSV, which is great for large scales of data. And then Excel, if you wanted to take the report to Excel and add some customization, like changing the fonts or adding some color, that kind of stuff to your report. So you can choose any of those formats and then move on from there. So if we chose printable, so we'd be running the report today, checkbook 1, all programs. We want the information through July 31st. We're going to store it in Intacct if we want it as a PDF. I click OK, and it's going to tell us it's being reported or being processed. Check my stored reports for report results. So this is the place that will have our stored reports. When I go there now, the report we just ran, which is the very first one, still says in process because it's not ready yet. It's going to take a few minutes for that to run. I ran one offline before we started the session today, so I have one available here. When it's available, you would get an email from Intacct telling you that the report you just ran is ready for viewing. If you have tried running these reports and you haven't gotten an email, or you're going to start using this and you want to be able to receive emails, go into your preferences as a user, click on your name, click on My Preferences. There's a section on your page called Email Notifications, and you can check mark the things you want to receive notifications for. So I have stored reports. When they're generated and available, Intacct emails me. Make sure that's check marked and then click Save. And there's some other options for different email notifications if you're using those that you can check mark as well. But this is the one we want to turn on. Stored reports are generated and available. When that report is available, the format we requested it in, it'll say that here. We click on that. Now the report will open for us. So I use a test funding source I have earlier. So here's that report. You know, it's simple. Doesn't tie up your computer while you're waiting for it to run. Doesn't tie up Intacct. Emails you whenever it's ready. And so especially useful for life-to-date type of reports or reports you anticipate is going to have a lot of information. Or if you just want it to run, schedule it for a future day. You can do it that way. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to put them in the chat box on the bottom right of your screen. If you have questions about these types of reports, you can ask now, otherwise we'll move on to dimension balances and actually running those reports. Okay, so let's go to dimension balances. For those of you that are listening live, are these reports you use now, have you ran a dimension balance report through the general ledger? So I'm going to the general ledger, and under the report section, I'm going to dimension balances. So very similar to running a trial balance or general ledger report, if you've run one, it's going to ask us for the same information. What period of time do we want to see for this report that we're about to request from Intacct? So let's use fiscal year. You can scroll through, find a period of time that fits. So I have fiscal year to date, I'll pick that, which means it's going to run for the tribe's fiscal year to the date that's in this box. So through August 12th. If I didn't want to go through the list of 100 or so different reporting periods, you can override what's up here by typing the dates in this box. Okay. So I'm just going to run with that. If we were a program whose fiscal year doesn't match the tribes, and we chose fiscal year as a reporting period to run the report, we're going to have information that's left off. So transportation has funds that run, I think, July to June. Diabetes has funds that run January to December. Head Start has funds from April to March, and then also September to August. If they use this option, it's not going to grab all of the information they need. So they would have to actually put in the start of their fiscal year manually instead of picking something from the drop-down box. So for this one though, we're running one from general fund, so we're going to use fiscal year through August 12th. The next thing we need to tell Intacct is what is the reporting book we want to use. It defaults to accrual book. And as we mentioned at the top of this, the accrual book is where all of our expenses are recorded. So if we just leave that selection on, we're just going to get expenses back. So that's great. For this example, we're going to use expenses. If we wanted to add encumbrance book, right below it says other books, we could click select and then add encumbrances. But for the moment, let's just look at accruals. We'll come back and run one for encumbrances as well. A recent addition, I want to say in the month of May, is on this report, we can run actual. We can look at just the budget, or we can run actual and budget. So for now, I'm just going to run actual. We'll loop back and add this to our report later as well. What account number or account numbers do we want to run this for? In this example, I'm going to run a specific one. I'm curious about utilities. So we're going to build this based on utilities. We can choose from multiple accounts if we wanted. So maybe I wanted utilities and travel or something like that. We could click here and then just start adding multiple accounts that we wanted to return in this report. Up to you on how that's done. We can say we want all accounts. So if we chose all accounts, that's literally every single thing from your cash account all the way to the last item on your list that gets activity posted against it. If we have all accounts selected, but we don't necessarily want all accounts, say we wanted all expenses, we could choose an account group. So I might choose an account group that says all expense GL accounts, which would then limit this report to only returning any account used for expenses for the filters I'd use for my program. We're going to use that again in another report run here shortly. But for now, I just want a range. I just want that utilities account. So I've got utilities selected. I'm going to use all programs, checkbook 3, and I'm going to leave funding source blank because I want any funding source that matches this selection for any program in checkbook 3. So funding source, leaving it alone. I'm not asking for a specific customer, vendor, employee, item, or class. I'm going to leave all of that blank. And then down here is the format, is how do we want to build this report? If we haven't run this report before, this is what we'll see. It's going to say format, show dimension values, select. So what information do I want to see come back for all of this? So when we hit select, the left side gives us a list of all the things we can add to this report. It says all programs. So one thing we probably want to know is the program being used. So we can find the program name in this list. So I'm going to do that. As we add different dimensions to this, we can choose the information we want this report to be based on. So by choosing program name first, when I run this report, it's going to run alphabetically by the name of the program. If there was no other information I wanted to show, I can click done. We have an option to add totals to this report. So I have that selected. And then how do we want the report to look? Cascaded or side by side? So I'm going to leave it cascaded for the moment just so we can see what that looks like, and then we'll run side by side. So when I click view, the report is going to run very quickly the total expenses by each program through the general fund for that utilities line item. And I was able to do that for a number of programs, all their expenses for a fiscal year. That took less than 2 seconds to run the report. And then we have the blue highlight, the blue hyperlinks here, that if we wanted to explore this more, why is there a credit balance on this particular one? We could click that and then dive into the general ledger. I'm going to hit customize because we're going to change something. So this is what the cascaded option looks like. What does the side-by-side option look like? In this instance, exactly the same. We'll see how that changes here soon. So now, instead of just saying utilities for all programs and the general fund, we're going to add a vendor. We only want to get the Cherry Todd expenses to come back to us. And now we want to add that to this report. So let's find the vendor name. So So we can choose, do we want just the name, just the ID, or both of those things to appear on the same line? We'll just choose name for the moment. We still have side-by-side selected. So I'll run the report as that. Now we can see the vendor ID has popped up for us. The amounts have changed. That credit amount that was for finance has dropped off because apparently that's not for Cherry Todd, for a different vendor. So this is what side by side would look like. This is what Cascaded does to the report. It now separates it so the Attorney General gets its own group, community services, education, and so on. So if we really wanted to showcase how different that is, we've done that option now. If you have questions about this report as we're going, or there's something you want me to pull up while we're doing this, by all means, please put that in the chat box in the bottom right of your screen. If you haven't used this before, this is a valuable report for you. So if we wanted to see multiple vendors, that we paid utilities for, not just Cherry Todd. We're taking off the vendor, we'll leave everything else the same. And just as quickly, we have all of that information now for each of the programs and the amounts they've spent with their vendors. So if we're searching expenses by vendor, take a minute to build this report and run it from here. And you'd have the answers for your vendor, committee, or whomever's wanting to know that information. No, it's not just for general account. It can be used for anybody. We have Anna in here. So an example I'm going to use momentarily is actually going to be for map 21. So with Lynette's perfect lead into this, segues us to the next type of dimension balance report we'll run. Map 21 doesn't use fiscal year because their contracts can run for multiple years. So if I work for Map 21 and I come to this report and there's some information I want to know, I might not use fiscal year. I can find inception on here, which basically means life to date. So now for my funds, for the entire period of time they're being used in Intacct, I want this report to come back for us. And as we talked at the top of this presentation, and then when we first got here, here's that accrual book. It's going to show our expenses. Well, maybe in this thing, I just want to see my encumbrances. So we're going to select another book where we're going to add encumbrances. This box is no longer grayed out. Do we want to combine our encumbrances and our accrual book? And if you've been to any of the other trainings I've ever given, I always say do not do that. So we're not going to use that right now. We're going to leave actual here. And instead of using utilities, well, let's use that group, all expense GL accounts. Our program of map 21, their checkbook 1. And now that we're using accounts, maybe now we need to see accounts on our report, right? So we want to come down here and change how this looks. So let's get rid of the current setup we have and let's build a new one. Anna has multiple funding sources at map 21. So maybe the first thing I want this report to group by is the funding source ID. And now instead of vendor, maybe we want to know the account ID and name. When I click done, we want this report to return to us each funding source and then every account ID that has an encumbrance against it. Click view. And now we have our encumbrances by line item and funding source for the life of all these funds. Took us 5 seconds to do it. And we have that list here. Now, Anna could print this, email it to Linda, or use that information for whatever she'd be looking it up, right? So let's customize and add more to this report. Typically, I always say do not combine accrual and encumbrance. In this instance, we're going to do that. So we're going to combine those two things. I had mentioned that we can actually choose actual and budget. So we're going to do that. It's going to default to RST budget. That's the one we use. So that's what we're going to have. And there's the draft budgets from our previous years that are there. So obviously we're not going to report on draft budgets. So RST budget is what's there. I'm going to leave it at all expense general ledger accounts. Same information we have here. The life of the report, so we've got inception selected. And we're going to build it on the same thing, funding source ID and account ID. Down here we can do a budget comparison. Do we want the budget in the first column or do we want it in the next column? How do we want this to look on our screen? And do we want to see a difference between the budget and that actual? Yeah, absolutely. And if we want to give the report a title, we could. So when I click view, we run the report. And now I have the life to date shows all funding sources financial report from the financial report screen. I didn't have to run it as a process and store and to do none of that. And it just took me a few seconds to do that. So the first column we have, real busy looking column right here, for inception, budget, RST budget for the period. Here's the budget for each of the line items going through. This column that says actual period balance is combining our encumbrances and our expenditures. So on a financial report, we see the encumbrances in its own separate column. We see month to date, life to date, or year, or fiscal year to date on our reports. This now is the combination of all of those, and of course now here's the budget difference of that. So if we needed this information more quickly or broadly, and we weren't concerned with what our month to date was, we now have that information, a budget report, and it took us seconds to do it. We can click print if we want this as a PDF. There's that title I gave it, and there's the report. So it's a pretty handy report to be able to do this. Now that they've added the ability to include budget in this report. And we can do this in almost any way that we can imagine. If we're looking for employees and how they were charged, you can build it for employees. I've shown we can do it for programs, for a certain checkbook, for a specific program and all of their funds. And our limitation is the amount of time that we want to do. Accrual book or encumbrances, or both. Do we want to see actual activity, or do we want to include our budget with this too? And what type of accounts do we want to use? Yeah, so if we had the report, and you know what, we didn't want all those accounts, we didn't just want one account, there was 3 accounts we were very curious about. We got utilities, we got travel, and maybe we wanted to know office supplies. And nothing else. We don't want to get the discussion we're about to have, sidetracked by the other information on the report. So I've got those multiple accounts selected. I click view, run the report again. I've cut out all those other things. We didn't want to talk about engineers today. We wanted to talk about our office related expenses. The cost to actually run map 21, not necessarily the projects that go with it. And we can see very easily, very quickly, just who those fundings are, what these expenses belong to and which funding source it is. Is there any other questions about this, the report that we're running here? Now's a great time to ask a question. So the next report that we're going to look at in the final report is a report called Purchasing Transaction Detail. But first we're going to run this one because I want to get a transaction that we can key in on. So we're going to go back to the fiscal year through today. We're going to run encumbrances. And let's go back to just that utility line item. All programs for general account. So now we want to run this report by program name and vendor name. Actually, let's do vendor name and ID. So if we were running a report, we're taking a look at what our encumbrances were. And we can see, okay, the Attorney General's office has an encumbrance for $1,100. We can click on the hyperlink and it takes us a list to all the general ledger activity for our encumbrance. Fortunately, we can see they only have one transaction, so this would be a pretty easy one to look for. And so if we needed to know the specific transaction that's being used, that's a lot of clicks that we're going to have to go through to try and figure this out. So as an option to us, we have a report called Purchasing Transaction Detail. So we're going to go to the report center, use our search bar, and I'm going to start typing Purchasing Transaction Detail. And it's brought that up. So we're going to use Purchasing Transaction Detail. It defaults to the fiscal year, so great, we're going to leave it at that setting. And we're going to run it for, I think it was the Attorney General Office, yep, and for Terry Todd. We don't know the funding source, or we don't want to enter that because we want any fund under the checkbook program combo to come up. By all means, leave funding source ID blank. We're going to look up Cherry Todd. And we know this is going to be utility, so I'm going to choose an item ID for utilities. You could leave it blank if you want it for any item ID. The next thing we need to tell Intacct, or the optional part of this, is what type of purchasing transaction are we looking for? So all the different purchasing transactions that we have access to are listed here. So if we were wanting just purchase orders, we could pick just purchase orders. For the moment, I'm going to leave it for all. State. If you are familiar or comfortable with the state of a purchasing transaction, by all means, you can choose those here. You can choose multiple ones, so if we knew we wanted all pending or partially converted items, we can add those just to this report. Or leave it blank if we wanted all of these. So we're going to run it for all for just a moment. So it's important as users, we know what these states mean, and especially what they mean for each purchasing transaction. You know, a state of pending applies to purchase requisitions or purchase orders. It doesn't apply to vouchers. So it's good to know what those mean. On my training website, ljstraining.info, there's an actual video that explains the purchasing states. If you weren't sure, you could go into Intacct's help and support. Go to the help center, type purchasing states, and it takes us a list that explains what each of those things mean. So there's plenty of resources out there for you to be able to explore. when the timing is needed. So we're going to leave this blank. I want all purchases for all states. For Cherry Todd, when the utilities was used for the Attorney General Office and the general account. We view this report. And it's going to run, and it's going to deliver back to us every single purchasing transaction ran this fiscal year for them. And so we can see the date the transaction was created, if it posts to the general ledger, that happens, the program, here's the funding source, checkbook, document ID. So if we wanted to know that purchase order, there it is, right? We know that purchase order is partially converted. It's assigned to us that that's probably a blanket purchase order. We haven't converted the full amount of the purchase order. Purchase order was originally opened at $2,940. So if we saw the $2,940 and we circled back to that dimension balance, is that going to be the amount that's showing as an encumbrance? Nope, it's less. That partially converted deal gives us a clue as to why. Here's that line item, the name of that line item, our vendor, the thing used on the memo line, here's our vendor document number. So here's that $2,940. Here's the instance of how much of this purchase order has been converted. So we know we used $2,940 started. We've actually converted $1,943.12, meaning the purchase order has $996.88 available. Here's the purchase requisition, that's the second line. We know that's been fully converted. Here's the vouchers. And we actually have a voucher that's partially approved, meaning it hasn't been fully paid, which also means the encumbrance hasn't been released. So we can take into consideration this $120 and this $996. And hopefully that matches the amount on the other way, right? There we are. We found the two purchasing transactions that contribute to that encumbrance. And it just took us a few minutes to do that. So if we were looking at our activity and we were, as was pointed out in the chat room, as a good way to close a fiscal year. If you were in the closing fiscal year training I did last month, and then again I did that also in June, I use this report as one of the bases for closing your year. We're coming close to 9:30, and we should be looking at our encumbrances and our purchase orders that are open and working to close those. And so if this were the end of the year and we're finished paying our stuff, very easily we found that purchase order that's open that we could now close. And so we can look for any transaction, or if we go back to customize, let's dig into this a little deeper. So I know that pending purchase orders are waiting for me to convert to pay. And all of us should know that also means there's an encumbrance if we have a purchase order in a pending status. So we're going to look for activity that's pending. As we've seen on that other screen, any purchase order that's partially converted is a blanket purchase order we haven't fully utilized or closed, meaning we have an open balance on that purchase order, which tells us we have an encumbrance. So we're going to keep that open. There's other activity that could be pointing to a encumbrance not removed. If we've converted the purchase order into a voucher and submitted for payment and it got declined, that encumbrance isn't released, is it? It's still sitting open. So let's add decline to this list. A voucher that's submitted might show up on that list, or one that's partially approved. So now we've got these 5 statuses that we're going to use without putting in a specific purchasing type. So we click view. That report's gone from 10, 12 transactions now to 2. We have that partially converted purchase order. We have that voucher. Down at the end, there's that quantity remaining because we did convert the purchase order to this voucher. And then here's that voucher, hasn't been paid yet. So there's our total from this report. With any questions about this report, or a better question I might have for those of you here, is how many of you are using this report today? So look up your transactions. On this report, we get a hyperlink to the purchasing transaction. So if we needed to go to the voucher, click on the hyperlink, it's going to take us there. We know it's partially approved. We can take a look to see whatever it is, our attachments, and find out more information. Or if we weren't sure who we were waiting to have review and approve this, we can go to our history tab, click on approval history and find out. So we know that Barb has approved this and it's been submitted to Lynette. And so a very quick and easy way for us now to not only find out what's contributing to our encumbrances, we now know exactly where the purchase order stands or where the voucher stands and who it's waiting to have approved. And so we can do this with any of our checkbook or program access that you have, with a specific funding source, or leave it blank so that any funding source that comes up under the combination would work. You can choose a vendor or leave it blank for any vendor. Is there a certain line item we're curious about, or do we need to see all of them? Or if we said, you know what, we only wanted to know about purchase orders more specifically. Purchase orders are never declined or submitted, so we'll take those away. They're never partially approved. So we may only have these two things left, pending and partially converted. We run that report, and now when we're done, we should have just the one transaction. Now we have just the one. We'd see this and see, okay, it has $996 available. That should be our open encumbrance, right? We come back here and see, no, that doesn't match. We're not sure why. We can expand the reporting to vouchers like I did. You could click on the purchase order link. So now we go to the PO. We were wondering, why does our report say $1,100? But this report says the PO only has $900 left on it. When I go to the history tab, here's everything that PO has become. And of course, the very last one tells us not everything's been fully approved. And so there's a couple of paths for us to take that we can find those encumbrances. Thank you everybody for your time. Have a good rest of your day.